He thought she was just another woman he could intimidate, until she walked into court and ended his career. The road stretched ahead, dark and nearly empty, the glow of streetlights flickering against the wet pavement. A few cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the misty night air, illuminating the stretch of highway outside Charleston, South Carolina. It was late, just past 11 p.m., the kind of hour where most people were home, winding down from the day. But not Lieutenant Commander Naomi Sinclair. She had been driving for nearly 2 hours, her hands resting comfortably on the steering wheel, fingers tapping lightly to the soft rhythm of an old jazz tune playing through the speakers. The melody was warm, familiar, a reminder of late-night conversations with her father, who had introduced her to jazz when she was just a kid. She wasn't in uniform tonight. Just a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. No medals, no insignia, nothing to suggest she had dedicated over 2 decades of her life to the United States Navy. Out here, she was just another driver on the road, another face in the night. Or so she thought. Then, the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her stomach clenched, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. She had seen this play out before. She knew exactly how these things could go. With a slow, controlled breath, she flicked on her turn signal, changed lanes, and pulled onto the shoulder of the road. She parked, cut the engine, and placed both hands on the wheel where they could be seen. She had been in the military long enough to know the drill. Behind her, a white patrol car rolled to a stop. The officer inside took his time. She watched through the mirror as he finally stepped out, moving with a kind of slow confidence, the kind of walk that belonged to a man who expected instant obedience. His heavy boots scraped against the asphalt as he approached. One hand rested casually on his belt, the other gripping a flashlight that flicked on, shining directly into her window. Naomi turned her head slightly, catching the reflection of his name badge in the glare. Kearney. Sergeant Thomas Kearney. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation. Just those 3 words, spoken in a flat, practiced voice, one that carried the weight of impatience. Naomi met his eyes through the mirror. She said nothing, just reached, slowly, deliberately, for her glove compartment, retrieving her documents and handing them over. Was I speeding, officer? Her voice was calm, even. Unshaken. Kearney didn't answer right away. He held her papers in one hand, using the other to casually scan her vehicle. Then, finally, tail lights out. She frowned. That didn't make sense. That can't be right, she said. This time, he looked at her directly. Are you arguing with me? The words came with a shift in the air, that quiet, unspoken moment where power meets resistance, where one side expects the other to fold. Naomi had seen it before, in military briefings, in overseas operations, in training exercises meant to prepare soldiers for the real world. She had 2 choices. 1. Comply, let him have his way, and hope this encounter ended without escalation. 2. Push back, demand answers, and risk what would come next. She knew better than to push. But she also knew her rights. I'm just saying, she replied, her tone steady, measured. My tail lights were checked a few weeks ago. But if there's an issue, I can get it fixed. Kearney's expression didn't change. Step out of the car. The command cut through the night air. Naomi exhaled slowly. She glanced at the traffic ahead. No witnesses. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel once, then reached for the door handle. Mind telling me why? Kearney tilted his head, a smirk playing at the edge of his lips. Because I said so. She let that hang between them for a second. Then, with the same controlled grace she had been trained to maintain, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. The night air was cooler than she expected. She stood with her back straight, her shoulders squared, exuding a quiet strength. She wasn't looking for trouble. But she wasn't about to be bullied, either. Kearney took a step back, scanning her. She could feel it, him sizing her up, deciding how much he could get away with. Turn around. Hands on the car. This time, she hesitated. For what reason? Kearney took a step closer, his smirk fading. Are you resisting? Her eyes locked onto his. No, she said, voice unwavering. I'm asking a question. A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, maybe even amusement. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. We got a non-compliant driver here, he muttered. Then, louder. Turn around. Naomi's pulse picked up slightly, but her face remained neutral. Officer, she said, her voice low, firm, controlled. I need you to understand something. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do. And I know exactly what you can't do. Kearney's jaw tightened. You're under arrest. His hand shot toward her wrist. Naomi moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough to avoid his grip. Under arrest for what? He pulled out his cuffs. For obstructing an officer. She exhaled sharply through her nose. So that was his game. Her military training kicked in. Heartbeat steady. Breathing even. She knew what was happening. And she knew exactly how to handle it. Even Lieutenant Commander Naomi Sinclair knew she had only two choices. Comply, let this play out, and fight it later. Or push back, demand answers, and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become another statistic. With slow, deliberate movements, Naomi turned and placed her hands on the roof of her car. The cool metal pressed against her palms as she braced herself. Behind her, Sergeant Thomas Kearney wasted no time. His grip was rough, unprofessional, as he yanked her arms behind her back, snapping the cuffs on too tight, a calculated move meant to cause pain. Naomi's jaw clenched, but she gave no reaction. Then came the shove. She stumbled slightly as he forced her toward his patrol car, the sharp metal of the cuffs biting into her wrists. You don't know what you're doing, she murmured. Kearney let out a low chuckle, amusement laced with arrogance. Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing. But he didn't. Not even close. Naomi sat stiffly in the back seat, her shoulders squared against the hard plastic. The cuffs pressed against the sensitive skin of her wrists, burning from how tight he'd locked them. The door slammed shut behind her. Outside, Kearney strutted back to his squad car, radioing something in, a performance, like he had done this 100 times before. Probably because he had. Naomi glanced at the partition separating her from the front seat. Her faint reflection stared back. Calm. Composed. But beneath that, something simmered. She had been through combat drills, high-stakes operations, interrogations in foreign territories. But this? This was different. This wasn't an enemy combatant or a war zone. This was a man with a badge, drunk on power, convinced he was untouchable. Minutes passed. Then 5. Then 10. Naomi shifted her hands slightly. The cuffs dug in. Too tight. He had done it on purpose. The driver's side door swung open, and Kearney slid in, whistling as he buckled his seatbelt. Well, he muttered, throwing the car into drive. Let's take a little ride. Naomi didn't respond. The patrol car lurched forward, pulling onto the road. The red and blue lights still flashed overhead, their reflections staining the pavement behind them. For a few moments, there was only the hum of the engine. Then, Kearney spoke. You know, he started, most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out. Naomi let out a sharp breath through her nose. And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop. Kearney barked out a laugh, shaking his head. Lady, you must really think you're somebody. She met his gaze in the rearview mirror. I don't think, she said smoothly. I know. For the first time, he hesitated. His knuckles flexed against the steering wheel, the smugness cracking, just a little. But he covered it up quickly. You military? He asked, his tone shifting. Naomi said nothing. Yeah, I figured, he continued. You got that attitude, that above the law type. He smirked. Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh? Still, she remained silent. Kearney clicked his tongue. Shame, he mused, shaking his head. If you just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this. Naomi's jaw tightened. The audacity. As if this was somehow her fault. Up ahead, the station came into view. A squat, gray brick building, just off the main road. The parking lot was mostly empty, late-night processing was slow. And for now, it looked like she was the only guest. Kearney pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned to look at her through the partition. Gotta say, he murmured, I do love when they make it easy. Before she could respond, he was out of the car. The door swung open a second later. Let's go. Naomi twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped out. The cuffs bit into her skin again, he hadn't loosened them at all. She kept her head high as he led her inside, past a bored-looking desk sergeant, and into processing. The holding area smelled like old coffee and sweat. A metal bench lined the far wall. A steel door led to the cells just beyond it. Kearney uncuffed her, just long enough to shove her through booking. Fingerprints. Mug shot. The whole routine. The officers behind the desk barely looked up, just going through the motions. She had seen this kind of indifference before. It was the kind that let men like Kearney thrive. When it was over, he grabbed her wrist again, leading her toward the cells. You think you're smart, huh? He muttered under his breath. She glanced sideways. I don't have to think. His grip tightened. She knew that got under his skin. The steel door groaned open. Kearney shoved her forward. Enjoy your stay, he sneered. Naomi caught herself before she stumbled. She turned. Watching. As the metal bars slid shut between them. Kearney smirked from the other side, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers, before walking away. The lock clicked into place. Naomi sat down on the cold, unforgiving bench. She exhaled slowly. One night. That's all it would take. Because Kearney had no idea who he had just messed with. Naomi took a slow breath and sank onto the cold metal bench, the chill pressing through the fabric of her jeans, grounding her. One night. That's all it would take. Because Sergeant Thomas Kearney had no idea who he had just messed with. The holding cell was small, just 4 walls, a single flickering light, and the stale stench of old sweat and disinfectant. She had slept in far worse conditions, hostile territories overseas, bunkers under attack, military outposts where the air itself vibrated with tension. This was nothing. But that didn't mean she wasn't angry. Beyond the bars, the faint murmur of officers talking at the front desk drifted through the air. The shuffle of paperwork. The clatter of a coffee cup. Naomi exhaled slow and steady. Control the breathing. Control the mind. Basic training drilled into her long before she even stepped foot onto a fleet. Then came the heavy footsteps. She knew it was Kearney before he even appeared. His stride had that same arrogant rhythm, the walk of a man who thought he was untouchable. A second later, he was there, arms crossed over his chest, that same smug smirk plastered on his face. Comfy? Naomi didn't answer. He tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars. You know, if you had just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now. She let a slow smile curl at the edges of her lips. Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be. For the first time, his smirk faltered, just for a second. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Annoyance. Uncertainty. He covered it quickly, scoffing as he glanced toward the empty holding area. No one's coming to get you tonight, lady, he shrugged. Guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude. Naomi just watched him, unmoved. Kearney leaned in slightly. His voice dropped lower, his words meant to intimidate. See, here's the thing. He paused, studying her like he was waiting for a reaction. People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get out of trouble. Naomi let him talk. Let him ramble. It didn't matter. Because he didn't know what was coming. And then, as if on cue, another officer approached from the hallway. Younger. Late 20s, standard issue uniform. Clipboard in hand. His posture rigid with unease. He stopped a few feet away, shifting awkwardly. Sergeant. Kearney barely glanced at him. The younger officer hesitated. Shifted on his feet. I think you need to see this. Kearney frowned, casting one last glance at Naomi before stepping away. She sat back, listening. The conversation was hushed, but she caught bits and pieces. A lawyer. A call from higher up. Questions about why she was being held. Kearney's voice dropped lower, sharp and annoyed. The younger officer stammered something in response, but whatever it was, it didn't seem to make him happy. Then, those heavy footsteps again. He stormed back in. Jaw tight. Hands clenched into fists at his sides. The smirk. Gone. What the hell did you do? He snapped. Naomi leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. I didn't do anything. She tilted her head slightly. But people talk. And some of us have friends in very high places. Kearney's face darkened. She could see it now, that moment of realization creeping in. The shift in power. He wasn't in control anymore. His world, his illusion of dominance, was starting to crack. With a final sneer, he turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath, and disappeared down the hallway. Naomi exhaled. It wouldn't be long now. And when the truth came out, Kearney was going to regret every single decision that had led him here. Morning. Light spilled through the narrow windows of the courthouse, casting long streaks across the polished floors. The air inside was crisp, the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones if you sat still too long. Naomi stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. She wasn't in handcuffs anymore. No orange jumpsuit. No holding cell. Just a well-tailored navy blue blazer, a simple blouse, and an undeniable presence. She wasn't alone. Beside her, attorney Olivia Hendricks flipped through a stack of papers, barely glancing up as people trickled into the courtroom. She was efficient, methodical. No wasted movements. No small talk. Naomi liked that. Then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. And in walked Kearney. He still carried himself like he owned the room. Shoulders squared. Chin lifted. But there was a difference now. A stiffness in his step. A tightness in his jaw. Because for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one holding the power. A flicker of something passed across Sergeant Thomas Kearney's face, something that hadn't been there before. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. Lieutenant Commander Naomi Sinclair caught his eye. He looked away. Good. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and the judge entered, bringing a wave of silence over the courtroom. Judge Robert Whitmore, an older man with a weary expression, adjusted his glasses as he settled into his seat. He didn't waste time. All right, he sighed, flipping through the case files. Let's get to it. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat and stood. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Sinclair, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Thomas Kearney. A murmur rippled through the room. From the defense table, Kearney shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. Judge Whitmore peered at him over his glasses. Sergeant Kearney, care to explain? Kearney leaned forward, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. The prosecutor didn't even let him finish. Uncooperative, he repeated, arching a brow. He turned to the table, lifting a document. Lieutenant Commander Sinclair's record shows a distinguished military career, graduate of the Naval Academy, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken tail light? Kearney opened his mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched. The prosecutor continued, flipping through his papers. Additionally, an internal review of your arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district. The murmurs grew louder. Kearney's face darkened. Judge Whitmore set his file down with a sigh. Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing. Kearney sat back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest. She resisted. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. The body cam footage says otherwise. A ripple of noise moved through the room. Kearney glanced at the judge, suddenly more defensive. I was following standard procedure. Judge Whitmore wasn't buying it. He turned to the bailiff. Let's play the footage. A screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. A video began to play. Naomi didn't need to turn and watch. She had lived it. The sharp bark of Kearney's voice. Her calm responses. The unnecessary escalation. The smug way he tightened the cuffs too much, just to prove a point. The room was dead silent when the footage ended. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, steepling his fingers. Sergeant Kearney, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest. And you failed to report the full details in your initial statement. Kearney opened his mouth, but the judge wasn't done. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Sinclair are hereby dismissed. The gavel came down, sharp and final. Furthermore, I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Kearney's conduct. The tension in the room snapped like a stretched rubber band. Kearney looked like he had been punched in the gut. His face flushed red, hands clenched into fists at his sides. Naomi simply exhaled slowly, controlled. She had never had a doubt. As she stood, collecting her things, she glanced toward Kearney one last time. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. Because this time, she wasn't the one who had to fight for her reputation. Kearney was. Kearney stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished hallways. His face was tight. His jaw clenched. And he could feel the eyes on him. Other officers. Court staff. Even reporters, who had shown up after news of the case spread. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control. To walking into a room and commanding respect, or fear. But now, the power he had taken for granted felt like it was slipping through his fingers. And then came the worst part. Sergeant Kearney. A sharp voice cut through the hallway noise. He turned. Chief Walter Hargrove stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The older man had been on the force for over 30 years, a respected figure in the department. His word carried weight. Kearney straightened. "Sir." Hargrove studied him for a long moment. Then, with a curt nod, motioned for Kearney to follow him into a private office. The second the door shut, the chief's tone dropped. "What the hell were you thinking?" Kearney exhaled sharply. "I was doing my job." Hargrove scoffed. He reached for a file on his desk and tossed it forward. It landed with a heavy thud. "That's not what it looks like from here." Kearney stiffened. Hargrove leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. "The body cam footage. The arrest history. The fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting." Kearney clenched his fists. He could feel it. The walls were closing in. And for the first time, he understood something. He wasn't just losing control of the room. He was losing everything. Meanwhile, across town, Naomi stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The city moved around her, people walking by, unaware of what had just unfolded inside that courtroom. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney, Olivia Hendricks. "Kearney has been suspended. Internal Affairs is launching an investigation." Naomi smirked. "Good." She tucked her phone away and started walking. Her head high. Her step steady. Because she had never been afraid of fighting for justice. And now, it was finally fighting for her. Kearney's nostrils flared. His jaw clenched. "What does that have to do with anything?" Chief Walter Hargrove leaned forward, his voice quiet but sharp. "Everything." Kearney scoffed, but Hargrove didn't blink. "This wasn't some random woman, Kearney. This was a high-ranking Navy officer. A lieutenant commander. You think this is just going to disappear?" Kearney looked away, grinding his teeth. "She was disrespectful," he muttered. She questioned me." Hargrove cut him off with a curt shake of his head. "That's not a crime." Kearney let out a bitter chuckle. "You don't get it. People like that." The chief's expression hardened. "People like what?" Silence. Kearney swallowed but said nothing. Hargrove let the weight of that moment settle before sighing and rubbing his forehead. "The district attorney's office is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling." Kearney felt his stomach twist. "What does that mean?" Hargrove straightened, his tone final. "It means you're being put on immediate suspension, effective now. Internal Affairs is investigating, and if they find what I think they're gonna find." He shook his head. "Your career is over." The words hit Kearney like a punch to the gut. His face burned. "This is bull." Hargrove held up a hand. "Don't finish that sentence." His voice was ice. "Pack up your desk. And if I were you, I'd get a lawyer." Kearney stood there, fists at his sides, his world unraveling in real time. And for the first time in his career, he realized he wasn't untouchable. Across town, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Sinclair sat in a quiet cafe, stirring a cup of coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The case had already made headlines. The footage had gone viral. Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested. Officer under investigation. She wasn't surprised. She had known from the second she stepped out of her car that night how this would go. She had seen men like Kearney before. Entitled. Arrogant. Used to bending the law in their favor. But this time, he lost. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney, Olivia Hendricks. Kearney has been suspended. Might face charges. Naomi took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. She glanced out the window, watching the city move on around her. The fight wasn't over. Not for her. Not for the people Kearney had likely hurt before. But today. Today was a win. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain as Naomi stepped out of the cafe. The weight of the past 24 hours should have lingered on her shoulders. But it didn't. She walked with the same confidence she always had, head high, step steady. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a number she recognized. She sighed, then answered. Lieutenant Commander. The familiar voice greeted her. Captain Marcus Holloway. I assume you've seen the news. I have. A brief silence. Then, and how are you feeling? Naomi caught her reflection in a nearby storefront window. She saw no signs of defeat. No cracks in her composure. I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do. The captain's voice softened. That's what I thought you'd say. A pause. Then. The Department of Defense has taken an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it. Naomi exhaled through her nose. Not sure I'm interested in being a headline. You already are, the captain countered. And whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something bigger. She knew that. She had always known. Kearney wasn't an isolated case. He was part of a system that had allowed officers like him to operate unchecked for years. This wasn't just about her. It was about the dozens, maybe even hundreds of people who had been in her shoes, but didn't have her rank, her legal team, or her voice to fight back. Naomi leaned against a streetlight, watching the traffic move by. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, she said. And it won't be the last. No, the captain agreed. But it's the first time Kearney is facing consequences. And it's because you didn't back down. Naomi closed her eyes for a second, letting those words settle. She didn't back down. Not when Kearney pulled her over. Not when he tried to intimidate her. Not when the cuffs tightened around her wrists. Not even when she spent the night behind bars, knowing full well the deck had been stacked against her. She had stayed firm. And now. She had won. The captain cleared his throat. One last thing, he added. You might be getting a call from the mayor's office. Naomi's eyebrows lifted. Oh. Seems they want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace. She smirked. Now that's ironic. The captain chuckled. You gonna accept it? Naomi thought for a moment. Then shrugged. I'll think about it. She ended the call and tucked her phone back into her pocket. Across the street, a mother walked with her young son. His small hand wrapped tightly around hers. He was laughing about something, carefree, full of life. Naomi watched them for a moment. The next generation. She had fought for herself, yes. But she had also fought for him. For every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Kearney couldn't wield their badges like weapons. She took a deep breath, then walked away. Her steps firm. Her purpose clear. Because this fight wasn't just hers. It never had been. Because power unchecked is power abused. And the only way to change the system is to hold it accountable. The story of Lieutenant Commander Naomi Sinclair is more than just a personal victory. It's a powerful lesson about resilience, accountability, and the necessity of standing up against abuse of power. Naomi's experience is not unique. Across the country, countless individuals face wrongful arrests, racial profiling, and unjust treatment at the hands of those meant to serve and protect. But what sets this story apart is Naomi's refusal to be intimidated, silenced, or broken by the system. She understood something crucial: power, when left unchecked, leads to abuse. And the only way to change that is to hold those in authority accountable. From the moment she was pulled over for a fabricated violation, Naomi knew what was happening. She had a choice: comply and let it happen, or push back and fight. Many in her position might have backed down, fearing the consequences of speaking up. But Naomi chose to fight, not just for herself, but for those who lacked the voice, the resources, or the platform to challenge injustice. Her calm defiance exposed Sergeant Thomas Kearney for what he truly was: a man who had abused his badge and authority for years, operating under the assumption that no one would ever challenge him. The turning point in the story was when Naomi's arrest footage went viral, sparking a public outcry. This highlights another important lesson: the power of evidence and awareness in today's world. The truth had always been there, but without documentation and exposure, it might have been buried like so many similar cases before it. Technology, public attention, and unwavering persistence played a crucial role in ensuring justice was served. Another key takeaway is the importance of institutions taking action when wrongdoing is exposed. Chief Walter Hargrove's decision to suspend Kearney and launch an investigation proved that when the right people are in positions of leadership, change is possible. The justice system, though flawed, can still be used as a tool to dismantle corruption, if people demand it. Naomi's case forced an internal review, not just of Kearney, but of every arrest and incident he had been involved in over the years. Her victory was not just about clearing her name, it was about holding the system accountable. Most importantly, Naomi's story is a reminder that one person's courage can create ripples far beyond their own experience. By refusing to accept injustice, she inspired a movement, one that called for police reform, fair treatment, and a future where people, regardless of race or background, do not have to live in fear of those meant to protect them. Her final moment in the story, watching a mother and her young son, symbolized exactly what was at stake. This fight isn't just about today. It's about securing a better, safer world for the next generation.